Okay, so good morning everyone and welcome back. So this is going to be a little bit different and possibly weird of a video based on the other videos I've done on this channel talking about the history of trains and routes and all those various whatnots. Normally I would be talking about a historic route of one of Amtrak's predecessors rather than talking about an Amtrak route that exists today, but Amtrak's Cascades corridor is an interesting route, and it allows me to talk about a few different local routes and local services and basically just cross them off my list. And a lot of these routes, no offense, are not particularly interesting to talk about, so it allows me basically to jumble all these into one giant video rather than trying to do a bunch of 3-minute videos saying, hey, a train ran from here and this is what it was like. I did mention in the video about the Southern Pacific Cascades train that the SP did run local services in Oregon at one point, and now I'm going to go over that into slightly more detail. But to quickly recap the history of the SP in Oregon, Central Pacific/Southern Pacific bought the Oregon and California Railway, which was attempting to build a rail connection between Portland and California. Construction on that started in 1868 and finished in 1887. There were fits and starts in construction, which happened with a lot of railways in this period, especially as you got further west and into more rural areas. And it did stop, I think, in the 1870s at some point for bankruptcy reasons. Eventually, the SP took over the project and finished it with a connection over the Siskiyou Mountains. This cut the 7-day stagecoach trip between Portland and Oakland down to a 38-hour train trip. This also fed into the competition with E.H. Harriman. His actually, his name might have been Edward. I forget what his name was. And James J. Hill, who are attempting and were battling for control over the railway business in the Pacific Northwest in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Harriman owned the Union Pacific Railway and had a 45% interest in the Southern Pacific, which basically gave him control over the SP since he was may not have been the majority stockholder, but he was the largest stockholder and was a very forceful person in his time. And this is an interesting story in its own right, and I will eventually make a video on the conflict between Hill and Harriman. But to keep this story shorter and more on point as to what I'm doing in this video, I will be kind of just glossing over some of the more interesting points, but mentioning a few others that at least pertain to services in Oregon and Washington. The shorter of this story is that James J. Hill owned the Great Northern Railway and had a controlling interest in the Northern Pacific, which Harriman at one point attempted a hostile takeover of. These two railways had split ownership of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, which gave them both access to Chicago and other parts of the Midwest, and the CB&Q actually did run as far west as Denver, but didn't really connect with the other two railways that far south. But basically they were what was called a Granger system, which fed and dealt with a lot of agricultural traffic in the Midwest and Plain States, even if it didn't connect with the Great Northern and Northern Pacific. And the GN and NP split 98% ownership of the CB&Q. Or at least I think it was 98%. I might be wrong on the numbers, but it was well over 90% of the company was owned by those two. And one was owned by Hill, and then one majority, or at least plurality, controlled by Hill. But anyways, this combined system gave them access from Chicago all the way into Washington, and then eventually they also built the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway, which was split 50-50 between GN and NP and gave them access from eastern Washington into Oregon. In 1910, the Oregon Electric, which had already been built south from Portland to Woodburn and Salem, was bought by the Great Northern and given to the SP and S to operate the line. And the Oregon Electric was fully finished to Eugene in 1912. The O&D line was a feeder line for the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, and thus all of the Hill lines. As time went on, the O&E was just a branch line of the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, and later Burlington Northern. Passenger services ended on this line in 1933, and electric operations ended in July of 1945. And in 1995, it was spun off to the Class 2 Portland and Western, and is currently in the hands of that railway. And Oregon DOT has investigated upgrading that line for use as the line for the existing Cascade services between Portland and Eugene due to overcrowding on the SP, now UP line. Passenger service on the Oregon Electric was a rather splendid affair compared to most other interurban railways in the U.S. The O&D ran baggage and mail cars and standard coaches, which was fairly normal at the time, but also to compete with the SP and standard locomotive-hauled trains to California, the O&D offered observation cars with food service, smoking lounges, parlor cars, and all that on top of the standard cars. And they even had specially built sleeping cars for operations between Portland and Eugene. Now, even back then, the distance between Portland and Eugene was not long enough to necessitate an overnight trip, so this was done for people to board somewhere along the line. Get usually in Oregon, or not in Oregon, Portland or Eugene, they're both in Oregon, me Englishing, and the trains would go from either north or south, and then the cars would just be left at the stations along the way, and you'd sleep through the night. So it basically made the whole rolling hotel thing for that trains generally were more obvious, since you would get on at one of the end stations and spend most of your night sitting at your terminating station and waiting until morning, or sleeping till morning. But anyways, that's just like the short rundown on their history. In Southern Pacific, services along the Cascade corridor were far different. They were a mixed affair by comparison. For what I understand, also the O&E, I think, ran at most 4 trains, daytime trains, at least before they dropped service in 1933. But anyways, back to the SP trains. Trains that ran the SP route before the streamlined era were the Shasta, the Cascade, the Klamath, the Beaver, the Rogue River, the Oregonian, and a few other unnamed trains, and mail trains as well. As time went on, the Shasta became the Shasta Daylight, and the Cascade was streamlined. The SP did maintain a network of connecting bus services across Oregon as well, along with long-distance trains that ran into Oregon. The SP also ran other trains. These were services as far as Coos Bay, and it even was a train that had some through sleepers. I believe from Oakland was where the through sleepers came from to Coos Bay. They also ran a mixed train to Tillamook Bay and a train that went as far south as Ashland. So on the map, it's the pink line that goes south of Eugene. The red line is the SP Eugene Portland line, and then the other 2 lines are also in pink. And as you can tell, these trains extend far beyond the limits of the modern-day Cascades corridor, but they contributed to the history of this route. Back in the 1990s, Oregon DOT did run a few demonstration runs with the Talga trains as far south as Ashland to see if there was support for an extension south of Eugene, and as far as I can tell, nothing has ever come of that. So now moving on, the next major leg of the Cascade corridor is the Seattle-Portland service, which was known as the Seattle-Portland Pool trains, or Pool service, which as the name implies is the Portland-Seattle leg. So the first railway was built by the Northern Pacific from its original terminus in Tacoma, Washington, and built to Kalama, which is a little bit north of modern-day Vancouver, Washington. The service started in 1874, and included a ferry from Kalama along the Columbia River to Portland until 1908. Seattle was connected in 1884, and this was actually fairly difficult to find, and there's only like one Wikipedia article actually explaining this history, so if the history is inaccurate, please let me know, because Wikipedia is not always trusted, but again, it was the best I could do, because I swear, if you Google anything about rail history along this corridor, all you get is high-speed stuff and nothing from like pre-2010, so it's annoying. In 1908, the Portland, Spokane and Seattle Railroad completed the Columbia River Bridge, which was part of the conflict between Harriman and Hill. After the connection between Portland and Seattle was completed, the 3 railways that served the Portland-Seattle market agreed to pool their services. The deal was that the tickets would be cross-honored between the 3 railways, so the Great Northern can sell tickets on trains that are operated by the Northern Pacific or the Union Pacific, and vice versa. The peak year of the pool service was 1914, when there were 11 round trips between Portland and Seattle. The Northern Pacific and Union Pacific both ran 4 each, and the Great Northern ran 3. During the Great Depression, the pool service frequency dropped down to each railway only running 1 trip per day, and this schedule was in effect until the BN merger, when the Union Pacific ran 1 train a day and BN ran 2. The service standards along the Portland-Seattle portion of the corridor varied a lot. The GN ran mostly coast trains, the UP ran their streamliners to Seattle as their contribution to the pool, and the SNP also ran some of the SP's connecting trains to Seattle, as well as their own mash of services. But all these services had coach cars, diners, lounges, and through sleepers for the most part. The upside was that until the end, there was a morning, afternoon, and evening service, so there was still... This is probably one of the few parts of the country that actually did maintain rather decent service up until the beginning of Amtrak, which is unusual for most of the West Coast, considering the SP basically axed all their services in California except for what the feds regulated. So it's one of the main reasons why even to this day we still have really crappy train service. But now we're getting into the part of the corridor, the northern chunk of the corridor. So service between Seattle and Vancouver was more like the service between Portland and Eugene, where there was only one railway handling most of the service between the two cities. I think Canadian Pacific might have had some lines, and I know the Milwaukee Road had some lines north of Seattle, but I don't know if they were contiguous with the rest of the system. So, and again, any history you try to dig is mostly going to either lead you to the GN or high-speed rail, so I kind of gave up on looking. So if there's more history, please leave it in the comments, because oh sweet bejesus, the internet sucks. Great invention, but it sucks sometimes. So this is going to be the part where I most talk about Great Northern's International. The International was the premier and final service the Great Northern ran between Vancouver and Seattle of the various incarnations of this service. At one point, there were 3 GN trains between Portland and Vancouver. So at the peak of the pool service, if I'm reading this correctly or reading the sources correctly, all the GN pool trains ran to Vancouver, and this included an overnight train called the Owl. And also, as a fair point, a lot of trains in the U.S. were called the Owl or the something Owl if they ran overnight. And then there were also local trains between Seattle and Bellingham and Vancouver and the U.S. border. And in 1937, the service was changed. There was a limited service and a local service between Seattle and Vancouver. And after World War II, the schedule changed again. And there were 2 limited service trains called Puget Sounders and a local train. And up until this point, all the trains were heavyweight trains. None of them had been streamlined. In 1950 is when the International was launched by the Great Northern, which was the streamlined train. And they were lightweight streamlined trains with like all the modern amenities, as hopefully I will be showing in the pictures, like coach seats, your cafe car with like a full kitchen, because they all did back then. And these trains ran north from King Street Station, where Amtrak currently terminates today, all the way up to Pacific Central Station, again where the modern Cascade line terminates as well in Vancouver, along with Via Rail's Canadian. The International might not have been up to the same standards as the Empire Builder or the Western Star, even, since they were local trains. But these 5-car trains packed a punch. They had your standard mail and baggage car, 2 full coaches, a coffee shop with a kitchen, tables in one half of the car, and then coach seats in the other half, as well as a round-end observation car that had parlor seats and a private room. The initial schedule for this route had 3 streamlined trains and 1 all-stop local. This was cut to, in 1960, to 2 streamliners and the local. And the local was eliminated on the Washington side of the border in June of 1969. And the local continued running on the Canadian side from Vancouver to the border until October of the same year, due to Canada or British Columbia's regulatory environment took longer to get the trains canceled. And this schedule would basically be maintained up until the BN merger, where it was dropped to 1 train a day. So scheduled that they actually still needed 2 train sets to run it, which they needed to run the 2 trips a day thing, because that's how the trains worked. And this train was eliminated on April 30th, 1971 is when it made its last run, because that's when the BN ended train service. And May 1st was the first day of Amtrak. So these trains were not retained by Amtrak, but Amtrak retained service along what became the Cascades corridor. What is today a continuous corridor, Amtrak inherited in a very sorry state. Service south of Portland was running on a tri-weekly schedule, since the SP convinced the ICC to let them reduce their services to tri-weekly between Portland and Oakland instead of fully dropping the service. Well, actually, the ICC made the SP do that. The SP wanted to eliminate all service, and the ICC said, no, you get tri-weekly, because that's how things worked. This made traveling to points north of Portland or south of it hard or next to impossible, since service north of Seattle, and since just service was hard, since only 3 days a week would a train be going north, and 3 days a week the train would be coming back south, so you couldn't actually make a same-day trip, or possibly even a trip the next day, depending on how the schedules worked. And service north of Seattle was discontinued. By 1977, things had changed, though. There were 3 trains daily between Portland and Seattle, which was, again, up to the peak of towards the end of the pool service. This included the Pacific International, which ran from Portland to Vancouver, Canada, starting in 1972. And for a year and a half, there were also 2 daily round trips south of Portland to Eugene, on top of the Starlight, which at this point was daily. The 90s is when service started expanding rapidly, and before then there was also like a lot of changes to the schedule as well, but in the 90s is when things started getting interesting and becoming more of the modern service that exists today. In 1993, WashDOT released a study showing that electrification or running a maglev would be impractical and expensive, and that upgrading the corridor with existing technology would be easier. The plan was to expand Portland to Seattle service to 13 round trips a day, with 4 of them running Seattle-Vancouver, and this would be done with the Talgo 6s. And at the time, they were performing their test runs and seeing how they would work, and if they would actually go through with the Talgo 6s or some other equipment. And also, this is at the time where 1 train was permanently extended south of Portland. And the pre-COVID schedule for the Cascade was 4 Seattle-Portland round trips, 2 Seattle-Eugene round trips, 1 Portland-Vancouver trip, and 1 Seattle-Vancouver trip, and the round trip on all of these. The long-term plan is still for the 13 Portland-Seattle trains, 6 to Bellingham, and 4 of those that go up to Bellingham going into Vancouver, and Oregon wants to increase the Portland-Eugene service to 6 trains per day by 2035. And as far as I'm concerned, this is actually kind of a pathetic plan, considering this is what they should have been pre-COVID, let alone what they should be in the future. And this is, quite frankly, there should be at least some portions of the system that probably should have hourly service. Like the Portland-Eugene part should generally be hourly, and even the Olympia probably to north of the northern parts of Seattle should also probably be close to hourly at this point. But I mean, I know I like trains and that's just me, but again, as far as transportation goes, the more urbanized and crowded parts of the corridor should probably have hourly or close to it service instead of what would 6 hours to 6 trains a day be? Every 3 hours there's a train? That's still not very good. But anyways, hopefully you enjoyed this short, dirty rundown of the history of the Amtrak Cascades corridor, which also is a bit long and short. And also, one thing I did forget to mention, while doing this is on the map of the route that I showed, is there actually was service between Portland and Seattle over both the Spokane, Portland, Seattle, which ran the Green Line north of the Columbia River, and the UP that ran the south side until they switched sides somehow and ran into Spokane. That was also considered a part of their services in the Pacific Northwest. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, there were more services on the once-a-day Empire Builder that currently runs a schedule, at least pre-COVID. So yeah, hopefully before I get distracted, I'm just going to leave that here and hope you have a good one and just enjoy the video, and hopefully you're back for the next one, which I have no idea what that's going to be because I haven't written it yet. Enjoy.